Today we're going to start section 2.1. In section 2.1, we're going to start talking about visualizing our data. When we were talking in section 1.3 about the data cycle, we said that as we're going through and we're trying to set up our interpretation of our data and we're going through the analysis part, generally speaking, one of the first steps that we want to do, that we want to consider, is visualizing our data. So chapter 2 is all about visualizing our data. Section 2.1 and 2.2, we're going to focus on numerical data. 2.3 and 2.4, we're going to talk about categorical data. And then we're going to talk about kind of just some general information in our last section. So as we get started, in the last chapter, again, we looked at our two different types of data. So in this chapter, again, we're going to focus on summarizing both types of data, beginning in this section with numerical data. So our first definition up at the top here, the distribution of a sample The distribution of a sample of data is a way of organizing the data. When we're thinking about and we're visualizing our data, seeing patterns in raw data might be difficult. So if we just have a list of data values, it may be difficult to see our patterns. Distributions of a sample record two things. It records the values that were observed and the frequencies let's try again here. The frequencies, right, or counts of these values. Right, we defined frequency in the last chapter as well. Different types of visual representation capture different aspects in the data. Right, so as we're going through this section, we're going to again be focusing on our numerical data. Right, so those are going to give us the values, right, that are observed, and then we're also going to talk about our frequencies, and then we're going to use these distributions to give us other different ways of picturing our data sets. Right, so when we're examining distributions, we're going to use a two-step process. The first step is going to be to see it, to actually visualize the data. Use a graph that effectively summarizes the data. Use a picture to display the data will help us see patterns. When we're thinking about numerical data, we're going to have three different types of graphs that we're going to look at in this first section: dot plots, histograms, and stem plots. Right, then after we actually visualize our data, we come up with our graph. We want to summarize what we see from our graph. We're going to look at a few different things. We're going to look at our shape. Is there symmetry? We're going to look at center. Is there a most common value? And we're going to look at spread. Right? Are there any data values far from the rest of our data? How spread out is our data that we're looking at? Right, so in section 2.1, we're focusing kind of on this first part, actually visualizing our data. And then in section 2.2, we're going to talk about the summarizing portion. So our first example down here at the bottom of the page, here is some raw data from the National Collegiate Athletic Association available online. This set of data shows the number of goals scored by NCAA first-year female soccer players in Division III in the 2012 season. Right, and then we see a list of a bunch of different numbers. We have numbers everywhere from 9 to 35. Some of them show up once, some of them show up multiple times. There's a pretty big gap at the end of our data, but it doesn't really tell us much. Right? So in our answer to, is this data easy to summarize as it is presented? We're going to say not really. Right. Right, we can see the basic information that's given to us in this data, but we also we could be looking for and wanting a lot more out of this data set. Right? So that's what we're going to look at in our next few examples as we're going through and organizing this data in different ways.